8 months into the Arab awakening and democracy remains elusive for the majority of the populations in revolt. But economic opportunity was also a major driver of the uprisings, and that is under even greater threat now than before. Are the Arab economies on the road to ruin? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Taimur Nabili. Now, it is now nearly 8 months since the Tunisian street vendor Mohamed Bouazizi made himself the fuse for the Arab Spring. His self-immolation not only toppled Tunisia's president, but it generated a wave of action that swept across the Middle East. Bouazizi's fatal decision was driven in large part by economics. And in Egypt, Libya, Yemen, Syria and Bahrain, the issues of food prices and unemployment are also high on the list of the protesters' concerns. But have their protests harmed rather than helped their economic prospects? The Institute of International Finance has been predicting sharp contractions in the economic output of many of these countries. Let's take Egypt for a start. The economy is the largest in the region. Its output is expected to fall by 2.5% this year after inflation. Syria and Yemen will experience even sharper contractions, with gross domestic product slumping by 3% and 4% respectively. And in Tunisia, the GDP is expected to decline by 1.5%. But the IIF does see Bahrain showing some positive growth this year. GDP is expected to grow by about 2.9%, but that's still the slowest pace of growth in that island state since the 1990s. Now, to discuss the situation economically in our Arab world, we have three guests today. In Beirut, Lassen Achi is an economist and a scholar at the Carnegie Middle East Center. Here in Doha, Ali Khan Sachu is a financial analyst and the CEO of Rich Investments. And in Amsterdam, Mauritius Wijfels is chairman of the Melba Group. He advises investors on doing business in the Middle East. Gentlemen, thank you all very much indeed for being with us today. The subject at hand is a fairly, I guess, difficult one to pin down, because the economies of these Arab regions perhaps not quite as easily defined or as easily measured as some. Let me begin with you in Beirut, Lassen Achi, if I could. Give us your thoughts on what the economic impact of these uprisings has been and might yet be.
Yeah, so the economic impact on the Arab countries has taken multiple dimensions. One of the first sectors that have been affected is tourism. Tourism is one of the key sectors in the region. It employs around 10 to 15%, depending on the countries. And it also contributes to GDP, to the economy. So this is important. And also the investment, because the climate of uprising and unrest is not conducive to investment. So foreign investment has dropped very sharply, as well as the domestic investment.
All right. Well, that's the aspect from how the foreign environment might interact with those Arab economies. What about within the Arab economies themselves? Let me come to Amsterdam, Mauritius Wijfels there. I mean, you do business within these economies. How is their inter-economy trade being affected, and is that an issue here?
Well, we primarily accompany foreign investors in Egypt. So, of course, I think in general there's a wait-and-see attitude about the situation. And a number of investors that we work with would like to just hold on a little bit and see what happens. However, at the same time, we do see that once the biggest turmoil will be over and democracies will be in place in countries like Egypt and Tunisia, there will be a huge opportunity to establish a rule of law situation which wasn't prevalent before, meaning that you will actually have a separation of the powers of the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary, all issuing, applying, and adjudicating laws that are based on public participation.
The issues of how the future might pan out, we'll come on to in a second if we could. I'm just thinking about the situation right now, because the economies in question are obviously suffering, not just because of the numbers we quoted, but also because because you can see it in their stock markets. Ali Khan Sachu, we've seen some fairly severe drops. Is this just the tip of the iceberg, do you think?
Well, I think, we've seen some huge drops. Egypt is down about 34% this year. Damascus, which is a small esoteric stock market, is down about 44.5%. So you can already see that a lot of liquidity has tried to exit the capital markets. I think they calculated at least $10 billion has left Egypt. Syria, it's very difficult to get data. It's a very closed society, but estimates are between 5 to 10 billion. Mr. Makhlouf was asked to deposit $1 billion in the central bank. And I think the two different two strands in this whole thing. I think you've got Saudi Arabia, which is a backstop to the likes of Bahrain. They've helped out Egypt a little bit. And then you've got the likes of Syria, which are now very much on their own. And I would argue that places like Syria have got a very short shelf life if this standoff continues much longer. And people aren't analysing places like Syria from that point of view. I can't see the Syrian regime being able to pay its bills for very much longer. And that surely is the point of no return for this policy of repression. Whereas if you compare that to someone like Bahrain, you've got Saudi money, you've got the bridge, you've already got the Saudi Arabians sitting as the banker of last resort. And I think that's an important difference to note amongst these countries.
Lassen, actually, in Beirut, do you see Libya or Syria as being particularly in greater danger than somewhere like Egypt? And do you see them getting close to the brink, as Ali Khan was saying?
Yeah, the situation in these two countries is much more difficult. The Libya, it's not only about growth, it's about the destruction of the country, the infrastructure in the country. So the recovery will take much more time to be seen. But in countries like Egypt and Tunisia, these countries have already been known for in foreign investment and also for tourism. So if confidence is reestablished in the short term, and this would need that the political process progress and the elections being held, so we can have a much legitimate government that would give confidence to investors and to tourists. In Libya, it will take much more time because we don't know how much time the civil war will take, and also the Syria, because we are still not really seeing the end of this massacre of the civilians.
Well, I mean, in most cases, we haven't seen the end, have we? Lassen, I mean, it's you again, as well as Mauritius, you're talking about the future and how things might pan out when the situation improves. But the point I'm still trying to find a level for is how bad can it still get? I mean, are we anywhere near a point where even a recovery is a possibility?
There are multiple scenarios. You are perfectly right. The scenario of coming back to some kind of confidence and normal situation depends on a number of factors that are uncertain for the moment. So be it in Tunisia or in Egypt, this would depend on the elections and the ability of these countries to manage this process and have a government, which will not be easy because they lack tradition of free elections and fair elections and free political participation. So this is also something uncertain. But uncertainty is certainly much more when we take the case of Libya and Syria.
All right. Well, Mauritius, let me phrase the question to you in a slightly different way then. Of the people with whom you deal, are there any that remain invested, that are still not pulling out and maybe even are thinking of expanding their investments right now? Are there people with remaining confidence in some of these economies?
Yes, absolutely there are. I represent a consortium that is specialized into the conversion of waste into energy. In a place like Egypt, that cuts two ways, because there is a a surplus of waste and there's a shortage of energy. So this is the type of technique that Egypt is waiting for, that any government, whatever its signature, will be keen to promote. And these investors continue. We work very hard, actually, on getting everything organized and worked out with the current government, and to get to the conversion stations, or centers, as you would call them, into place as soon as possible. And both the Egyptian authorities and the investors have a strong belief that this is the future for the country, and that there will be, after the current turmoil, enough stability to make these investments successful, both financially and, of course, for the well-being of the people of Egypt.
And in general terms, then, would you say that you think that the people who are minded to pull out of these economies have done so, and those that remain are the people that will remain for the long term? I mean, have we reached some kind of a balance point?
Well, I think for Egypt that would be true, but I think the perspective for Egypt, of course, is different from Syria or Yemen, where the situation is much more complicated and also more, violent. So looking at Egypt, yes, I definitely think that we've sort of seemed to have reached the bottom, and that there is an increasing confidence that these elections may actually, work out, and that a government, probably a coalition government, will come into life that one can very well work with.
All right. Well, we'll look at a couple of. It's
certainly not impossible. It's not a given, but it's certainly not impossible.
We'll examine a couple of the individual economies in just a second. But let me just come to you for a minute, Ali Khan. From your perspective, I mean, as someone who does go in and invest, and particularly maybe in stock markets and things like that, I mean, Egypt's trading, I think, somewhere near a 2-year low right now.
That's right.
If you saw that in London or New York, for instance, you would say, possibly a buying opportunity. Does the same sort of thinking come into play when you're dealing with a market like Egypt or with Syria, or do you think there's still a lot of other factors that are damaging sentiment, and it's not the kind of thing that you'd want to take a risk on?
Well, personally, obviously, I'm looking at it in a small-scale way. I'm not looking to do anything way too brave and go in limit long into the Egyptian stock market by any means. I think there's clearly, we're passing through the portal into a new normal, but when you pass through this portal, the volatility is so high. I, for one, know nobody who's keen on taking a big position in any space, in any of these places at the moment. In Egypt in particular, I'm hard-pressed to find people who are prepared to step forward at this moment in time. I can't find those folks. I mean, I'm really struggling. Somewhere like Damascus, I think the sort of people I'm speaking to, most of them are trying to borrow money off the government in the hope that the government will fall and they won't have to pay them back. So I think we're in this period when there are very few investors who are prepared to step up to the plate until they see much greater clarity. I know we've had these tremendous falls, as you've mentioned. Damascus is down 44%, but I've traded emerging markets for a long time, and these things can be drawn out for a very, very long time. It could take, it's not going to be neatly tied up, I don't think, in the space of a couple of months. We're still dealing with the end of a regime which was entrenched for so many years.
All right, Lassen, let's focus in a little bit more closely on Egypt and talk about the recovery potential here. Now, I guess for most people, it is the biggest economy in the region, and for most people, it's maybe the one that's most interesting. But do you see the way things are shaping up economically as being as going down the right path? And I'm thinking particularly in terms of the recent news that Egypt has decided it's, at least for now, seems to have rebuffed the IMF offer of help.
IMF offer of help, for the moment, there is, as I said, uncertainty, and the present government is much more an interim government, and would not have free hand to make long-term and medium-term decisions. And this is a handicap because there are issues that need to be tackled immediately. Certainly the country, and this is one of the countries that will need foreign help, because the budget in this country, the budget deficit is huge. and probably over 10% of its GDP.
But the interesting thing here is not necessarily that the size of the funds that are required or involved, but the way that the economic policy will be implemented, because the IMF generally tends to come into countries with a fairly standard package of procedures, and a lot of people are saying that it doesn't work. So Egypt's choice of which path to take is going to be an important one, isn't it?
Exactly, because one of the issues for the moment is whether to continue on the free market and market-oriented policies or to come back to some state-led growth. So there are voices from political parties, and there is still a debate on these issues. And this is why the former Minister of Finance was keen to have this support, but the whole population and the Tahrir Square's protesters declined this kind of help, because it means conditionalities and maybe it will impose restrictions on the elected government. So to have much more margin of maneuver in the future, they don't want to enter into these conditionalities.
Ali Khan, would you agree with that basic dichotomy here of the way Lassen put it, state-led or free market economic principles as being the issue here, or is there more to it? I mean, as I say, the IMF framework has been seen to be lacking in a number of different cases. Would you as an investor be more encouraged by the potential for growth if the IMF did go in, or if they didn't?
No, I don't think I would be more encouraged whether they went in or not. I think they made an offer. It was a political offer. I don't think their conditionalities would have maybe suited the Egyptian situation. I think all these countries are about empowering and enfranchising as many of their people as possible, as quickly as possible. And I think that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a political process I can buy into, where I think I can see that the majority of the Egyptians will buy into themselves. And until I see that kind of political process, I'm going to be a little bit sidelined. The potential of somewhere like Egypt is enormous, but it's been a very much a narrow elite that has controlled that economy. And I think in the 21st century, it's all about empowering as many of your citizens as possible, giving them a sense of ownership and a stake in the game. And I think that's going to be the sort of utopia where these countries are going to head to. That journey to that point is going to be extremely tricky, and we're right in the middle of that journey. With respect to the IMF, the IMF is retooling and recalibrating itself. It had a terrible history in many parts of Africa. And I think in this regard, Egypt was right to turn them down. But Egypt is going to have a very big funding problem very, very soon, unless the Saudi Arabians come to the rescue, as they already have done to quite some degree.
Mauritius, from your perspective and your client's perspective, what is the kind of change that they would like to see, and how likely are you seeing it as happening?
Well, I think many investors actually see the changes as welcome, in the sense that, as I alluded to before, you will have a situation of rule of law, which really means that, for investment purposes, you will have clear guidelines, clear principles, clear timelines, and funding requirements, and you're not dependent any longer on the small elite that may require specific privileges to be extended to them before the investment can be made. So it leads to certainty and clarity, and I think that's very much what investors are after. And whether that can be achieved, yes, I think it can. Of course, as has been put before, it will be a bumpy road and not something that will be achieved soon. But in a place like Egypt, I think there is a very broad consensus that in any event, a situation has to be brought about where investment continues or is again interesting. As for turning down the IMF, that's one minister who is meantime gone. We have to see whether the brand new minister who has a long-standing career, Dr. Hazem Bablawi, has a long-standing career with the United Nations and knows the Western world very well, whether he would see that in the same perspective, or whether he would be more inclined to also work with IMF. I think the cards are still open.
All right, let's look at the problem from a slightly different angle. And Lassen, I'll come back to you on this one. We're talking about foreign involvement from the perspective of investment up until now. But what about from the perspective of labour? Because mobility of people across these borders has been very high, and a lot of the GDP in these countries is driven by foreigners, whether it be foreigners coming in as labourers, or in Bahrain's case, you've got a lot of expatriate workers coming in to help run the banking system and make it a financial centre. The kind of confidence of being able to attract foreign labour into the economies must also have been damaged. How bad do you think the impact from that has been?
The issue of foreign labor is much more relevant for Bahrain, in fact, and as you said, it's not only low-skilled labor, it's also highly skilled labor. And yeah, it might also take some time, but in countries like Egypt, I think the most important issue is excess of labor, is the fact that you have a lot of unemployment, and also
right. I mean, Egypt relies a lot on its own people going overseas and sending money home, doesn't it?
Yes, but one of the issues is how to be able to use also the domestic labor in combination with the foreign labor, so that foreign investment can have an effect on the country. It's not only to have foreign investment that would use its own labor and produce and export, but also the type of foreign investment that would also have an impact on the rest of the economy and the rest of the labor force.
Mauritius, your thoughts on this particular aspect?
Yes, I agree with that. I think it's very important to bear in mind that there's a huge need for employment in Egypt. And coming back to the one project that I referred to before, the waste to energy will actually involve employment for many people, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands in the end. And I think that makes it very attractive for the Egyptian government to work with. And I fully agree that any foreign investment should be mindful of the local situation and enhance employment, as well as the standards that go internationally with it. I mean, there are now the guiding principles on business and human rights, as defined by Professor Ruggie on behalf of the Secretary General of the United Nations. Those principles, again, which address the state, they address businesses, and they address the relation between the state and the business, can also be guiding principles in affecting these investments in Egypt.
All right. Well, as we get to the last couple of minutes, Ali Khan, let me come to you with a question. Without meaning to be dismissive, I must ask, the so what question. At the end of the day, if we see a number of these economies struggling to get along and not really recovering in any meaningful way, will it, on a larger scale, make an impact anywhere else apart from within those countries themselves?
That's an interesting question. I think there are different degrees of that. I think somewhere like Yemen is really largely irrelevant to the global economy, other than the risk it poses if it implodes in terms of national security and its spilling out of its borders, and the risk it poses to Saudi Arabia. And that's a similar story with Bahrain. Syria is a very small economy at the moment, and I think Hillary Clinton's idea of choking off oil sales would probably tip it over its tipping point. Libya, of course, has about 47 billion barrels of oil, relatively cheap, that can be dug out of the ground. And therefore, it's relevant, I think, to the global economy, where you've had this very fine demand and supply balance and this recent surge in the fuel price, which makes it even more valuable. Egypt, with 80 million, with that huge economy, that huge amount of human capital, is key, I think, to the whole continent and elsewhere. So I think the different degrees, and I think, some countries are completely irrelevant from an economic point of view. Others are not.
Al-Hassan, very quickly, the international political aspect of all of this, the sanctions that Ali Khan just mentioned there, the international pressure on some of these countries, has that made much of a difference to the way things are progressing, and will it in the future?
I think so far we have a very ambiguous picture. We have the intervention in Libya, and we have the pressure now in Syria. And for the moment, in both cases, we didn't have really a way out immediately. So it's still taken a lot of time in Libya. And in Syria, it has taken too much time to have a firm and decisive decision from the international community. So in general, I would say that the position of the international community regarding the Arab awakening was very, very ambiguous.
All right, and there we will have to leave it, unfortunately. We've run out of time. Thank you very much indeed to my three guests, Lassen Achi in Beirut, Ali Khan Satchu here in Doha, and Mauritius Wijfels in Holland. Thank you all for talking to us today, and thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. We always welcome your comments and your suggestions. Our email address is insidestory@aljazeera.net. But it's goodbye for now.